The Grand Hall of the Galactic Council was a place of terrible beauty. Its walls stretched upward in curves that seemed to defy the normal laws of space, made from a material that gleamed like frozen starlight. The floor beneath Commander Teo's feet was smooth and cold, and it reflected the lights of 1,000 distant worlds. He had traveled across the galaxy to stand in this hall, and now, as he looked around at the assembled council members, he felt very small indeed. Teo wore the formal uniform of Earth's military, dark blue with silver markings that showed his rank and service. Beside him stood Dr. Wan, Earth's chief scientist and ambassador. She wore a simple white suit, her dark hair pulled back neatly. Both of them had prepared for this moment for years. They carried with them documents, data, and proposals. They carried humanity's hopes. The Galactic Council sat in a great semicircle, each member positioned on a raised platform. Some of them looked almost human, with 2 eyes and recognizable features. Others were strange and alien, beings of crystal and light, creatures that seemed to exist partially in other dimensions. They had ruled the galaxy for longer than humanity had existed as a species. They had technologies that could reshape planets. They had knowledge spanning millions of years. Counselor Vareth spoke first. He was a Zelonite, a being who had lived for 300 years. His skin was the color of deep purple, and his eyes glowed with an inner light. When he moved, it seemed as though the very air around him shifted and changed. He looked at the 2 humans before him, and Teo could see something like amusement in those ancient eyes. "The representatives of Earth," Vareth said, his voice like the sound of wind through ancient canyons. "We have reviewed your application for membership in the Galactic Federation. We have studied your world, your technology, and your history. We have come to our decision." Teo felt his heart begin to pound. This was the moment they had waited for. This was when everything would change. "Your species shows promise," Vareth continued. "You have achieved space travel. You have created functional governments. You have begun to understand the basic principles of quantum mechanics. For a species barely out of its infancy, you have done well." But there was something in the way Vareth said the words that made Teo's hope falter. He looked at Wan, and he could see that she felt it too. "However," said another council member, a being made entirely of crystalline structures that shifted and changed as it moved, "your species has a history of violence. Your records show countless wars. You have created weapons of terrible power. You have divided yourselves by arbitrary lines drawn on maps and by concepts you call nationalism. You compete rather than cooperate." "You are too young," added a third council member, this one resembling a mass of flowing liquid contained within an invisible field. "Your individual lifespans are short. Your civilizations rise and fall in what we consider mere moments. You lack the patience required for true galactic citizenship. You lack the wisdom that only age can bring." Wan stepped forward. She had prepared for this. She had arguments, data, proofs. "With respect," she said, her voice steady but quiet in that vast hall, "humanity has changed. We have put aside many of our divisions. We have created a unified world government. We have not engaged in large-scale warfare for over 200 years. Our young people are educated in cooperation and—" "200 years," interrupted Elder Kalen, the oldest member of the council. His form was barely visible, like smoke given consciousness. "To us, that is less than the time it takes for one of our philosophers to complete a single work. You speak of your achievements as though they are great things. But you must understand. You are children speaking of the accomplishments of childhood. You cannot yet comprehend what you do not yet know." Teo felt anger rising in his chest, but he forced it down. They had known the council might be difficult. They had prepared for resistance, but this was more than resistance. This was dismissal. This was an old, ancient civilization looking at a young race and deciding they were not worth the trouble. The Federation is built on principles that took millions of years to establish, Vareth said. You cannot simply join because you ask nicely. You must prove that you understand cooperation on a galactic scale. You must show that you have overcome your base instincts. You must prove that you will not be a danger to the stability of all species. And frankly, we do not see that you are ready. There was a pause. Teo realized that the council had already made their decision before he and Haywan had even entered the hall. All of this, the hearing, the questions, the discussion, it was all just a formality. The outcome had been decided long ago. Your application is denied, Vareth said. You will return to your world. You will remain under quarantine, separated from the greater galaxy. In 500 years you may apply again. Perhaps by then, your species will have matured enough to be considered for Federation membership. The words hung in the air like a physical thing. Teo felt as though they had struck him. 500 years. In 500 years he would be dead, and his children would be dead, and his grandchildren would be dead. The entire span of human civilization from the fall of Rome to the present day, repeated 5 times over, and the council thought that might not be enough. You are not being punished, added Kalen, with what might have been meant as kindness. You are being protected. The galaxy can be a dangerous place for young, unprepared races. Here, you will be safe on your little world. You will grow. You will learn. And perhaps eventually, you will become ready. Haywan's face was pale, but she did not cry. Teo could see her jaw clench slightly, but her voice remained professional when she spoke. We understand, she said. We will return to Earth and convey the Council's decision to our government. You do that, Vareth said, and tell them they should be grateful for our patience. Many younger races we simply eliminate if they seem too dangerous. You may yet prove to be a threat. That you are given another chance at all is a mercy. As Teo and Haywan turned to leave the hall, they heard Kalen's voice one more time. Perhaps learn some patience, little ones. And some obedience. These are lessons that will serve you well in the galaxy. The journey back to Earth would take weeks in the faster ships, but Teo barely noticed the passage of time. He sat in a small cabin and stared out at the stars. Beside him, Haywan sat in silence. Neither of them spoke much during the trip. There was nothing to say. But as they drew closer to Earth, something began to change in Teo's mind. The anger that he had forced down in that great hall, that he had swallowed and buried, it began to transform into something else. Not a desire for revenge, not a desperate plea to be accepted. Something far more dangerous, a quiet, burning determination. The Galactic Council had made a mistake. They had taken a young species that looked to them for guidance and turned that species inward, toward itself. They did not yet realize what they had done. Prime Minister Jiwoo sat in the central chamber of the world government, a room that had become very familiar to him over the past 6 months. Around the great circular table sat representatives from every continent, every nation, every people on Earth. They had been meeting constantly since Teo and Haywan had returned with the Council's decision. The room was thick with tension and despair. We should petition them again, said one delegate, a woman named Ye Jin from the Asian Union. We should present new evidence, new arguments. Perhaps we were not persuasive enough. They will not listen, said another voice, this one belonging to Commander Teo, who stood at the edge of the room. I was there. I saw their faces. Their decision was made before we ever arrived. The Council does not wish to be changed. They do not wish to be challenged. They see us as children, and nothing we say will alter that view. Jiwoo listened to the arguments, but his mind was working on a different level. He was an old man now, and he had lived through many crises. He had seen nations rise and fall, Technologies transform, and human nature remains stubbornly constant in some ways, while changing radically in others. And he understood something that many others in the room did not yet grasp. Sometimes the most powerful response to rejection is not to fight harder, but to walk away and become so exceptional that the one who rejected you comes to regret their decision. "Silence," Jiwoo said, and immediately the room quieted. Everyone turned to look at him. "We have been rejected. This is painful. This is unfair. But we cannot change the council's mind by begging. We cannot change their opinion by becoming louder or more persistent." "Then what do we do?" asked Yejin, frustration clear in her voice. "Accept that we are imprisoned? Accept that our children and their children will be kept separate from the galaxy because the council thinks we are too dangerous?" Jiwoo stood slowly, his old bones creaking slightly. He walked to the window and looked out at Earth below them. The planet was blue and green and beautiful, and it had been home to humanity for millions of years. It was not a prison. It could never be a prison, because humans had learned long ago how to make a home anywhere. "We will prove them wrong," Jiwoo said quietly. "But not by fighting them, not by arguing. We will prove them wrong by becoming better, by becoming stronger. By becoming so advanced, so intelligent, so capable, that when they finally see what we have become, they will understand that their fears were baseless. And then they will regret ever underestimating us." There was a long silence in the room. Then, slowly, people began to understand what the Prime Minister was suggesting. "You want us to advance," said Haiwan, who had been standing quietly near Taiyou. "Rapidly, on our own terms, without the Council's guidance or permission." "I want us to advance faster than we have ever advanced before," Jiwoo corrected. "I want us to take every resource we currently spend on weapons, on military strength, on the tools of war, and I want us to redirect that toward science, toward medicine, toward engineering, toward the future. I want us to become not a threat to the galaxy, but a beacon. A light that other species can learn from." "And we tell no one?" asked another delegate. "We simply disappear from the galaxy's view and work in silence?" "Yes," Jiwoo said. "Exactly that. We are under quarantine, so we do not send messages to the Council. We do not beg for their attention or validation. We simply work, we improve, we grow, and by the time they realize what we have become, we will no longer need their permission to join their federation." Over the next 6 months, the transformation began. Across every nation on Earth, military budgets were slashed and redirected toward research and development. Universities received massive funding increases. Space exploration programs were expanded far beyond their previous scope. The best minds in humanity were brought together, freed from the constraints of profit and competition, and given one simple directive: advance human knowledge and capability as quickly as possible. Engineer Min-Soo took charge of a massive project to design new spacecraft. These were not weapons. They were vessels of exploration, designed to be more efficient, more advanced, and more beautiful than anything Earth had ever created. He worked with teams of scientists and engineers, and together they produced designs that would make the old Starship models look like ancient sailing vessels. Dr. Haiwan led a different kind of research. She gathered the brightest minds in physics, biology, and chemistry, and they began to investigate phenomena that had never been studied before. They made discoveries that surprised them, new forms of energy, new properties of matter that had somehow been overlooked by humanity's earlier research. It was as though, freed from the burden of trying to impress the Council, human science was finally able to see clearly. A young woman named Yoonji, who had shown extraordinary talent in quantum biology, made a breakthrough in life extension. It was not immortality, but it was significant. Humans could now live longer, healthier lives. Disease could be prevented more effectively. The threat of aging could be managed. And perhaps most importantly, Yoonji's work opened doors to new fields of medical science that had never been explored before. Throughout all of this, there was one strict rule: no communication with the galactic community, no broadcasts, no requests for help or validation. Earth simply went quiet. The quarantine that the Council had imposed became something else, not a prison, but a shield. Behind that shield, humanity worked. Ki Young, a visionary thinker who had spent his early career advocating for galactic unity, redirected his efforts toward something more immediate and more powerful. He began designing a new form of government. Not something imposed from above, not something created by ancient beings who thought they knew better, but something that emerged from the collective intelligence of all humanity. He called it the system of shared purpose, and it was unlike anything that had existed before. Through this system, every human had a voice. Every human could contribute ideas. There was no single leader who could make decisions unilaterally, but rather a network of councils and committees where power was distributed widely. It was not perfect, but it was distinctly human, creative, adaptive, and remarkably effective. As the months turned into years, something remarkable happened. Humanity began to change not just technologically, but culturally and spiritually as well. The constant emphasis on growth and advancement brought a sense of purpose that had been missing for generations. People worked together with enthusiasm, knowing that they were building something meaningful. They were not working to please the Council or to prove themselves to an alien civilization. They were working because it mattered. They were working because they believed in themselves and in their species' potential. And all of this happened in silence. No announcements were made. No messages were sent to the Galactic Council. Earth simply continued its work, hidden behind the quarantine that had been meant to confine them, turning it instead into a shield that allowed them to grow without interference or judgment. Prime Minister Jiwoo, now very old, sometimes stood on the observation decks of the orbital stations and looked out at the stars. He wondered what the Council was doing, whether they ever thought about humanity, whether they had already forgotten about the small young species they had dismissed so easily. He smiled slightly when he thought about their eventual surprise. The old man had set something in motion that would not be stopped. Humanity had been rejected, and in that rejection, they had found their true path forward. 5 years had passed since Earth had gone silent. 5 years in which humanity had transformed itself in ways that even those directing the change sometimes found hard to believe. The transformation was not complete. Humanity would never be complete, would never stop learning and growing, but it had become something remarkable. Captain Dong Ho stood on the bridge of the Discovery, the first of humanity's new generation of exploration vessels. The ship was beautiful in a way that the old Earth ships could never have been. Its hull was designed according to principles that Min Su and his team had developed, principles that allowed the vessel to move through space with unprecedented efficiency. The engines hummed with a quiet power, and the walls of the bridge seemed to glow with a soft internal light. Ahead of them was something that no human had ever studied before: a stable wormhole in deep space, far from any galaxy the Council had ever explored. It had been discovered by accident during routine deep space surveys, and the discovery had sent shocks through the scientific community. The wormhole appeared to be natural, not artificial, and it seemed to lead to regions of space that were completely unknown. "Run the scans again," Dong Ho commanded, his voice steady and professional. Around him, the crew, some human, some synthetic intelligences that humanity had created in the past 5 years, worked at their stations. The synthetic minds were remarkable. They were not slaves or tools, but true intelligences, equal in consciousness and capability to human minds, just with different ways of processing information. One of these synthetic minds, a consciousness that had named itself Ara, reviewed the scan data. "The wormhole is stable," Ara reported. "The radiation signature shows it has been stable for at least 1,000 years. It leads to unknown space. Estimated distance on the other side, approximately 3 million light-years." Dong Ho made a decision that would have been impossible 5 years ago, when Earth was still seeking validation from the Galactic Council. He took the discovery into the wormhole. The experience was unlike anything Dong Ho had ever imagined. Space seemed to twist and fold around the ship, and for a moment it felt as though reality itself was bending. Then they were through, emerging into a vast region of space filled with stars that had never been catalogued, in configurations that revealed an entire universe that the Galactic Council had apparently never explored. "We did it," Ara said, and there was something in the synthetic voice that sounded almost like wonder. "We've discovered something new, something the Council doesn't know about." Dong Ho smiled. This was what it meant to be free. This was what it meant to pursue knowledge for its own sake, not for approval or validation. Back on Earth, similar discoveries were happening in other fields. Yunji's work in life extension had yielded results beyond anything the medical community had anticipated. The average human lifespan was increasing, and more importantly, the quality of that extended life was improving. Humans were becoming healthier, stronger, more resilient. In laboratories across Earth and in orbital research stations, scientists were making discoveries every week that pushed the boundaries of what was known about the universe. Some of these discoveries came from studying phenomena that the Galactic Council had apparently overlooked or deemed unimportant. Others came from asking questions that the ancient civilizations had apparently stopped asking long ago. Meanwhile, Qi Young's system of shared purpose had evolved into something even more sophisticated. The youngest generation of humans, those who had grown up in the post-rejection era, had taken the system and improved it further. They had created networks of decision-making that allowed millions of people to contribute their ideas and insights. The result was a form of governance that was more responsive, more adaptive, and more just than anything that had been tried before. But perhaps the most significant development was the creation of humanity's colony ships. 5 massive vessels had been constructed, each one capable of carrying 1 million people across the vast distances between stars. They were not weapons. They were not tools of conquest. They were seeds. And they were ready to disperse humanity across the galaxy, not as conquerors or invaders, but as explorers and builders. The first colony ship, named the Hope, was commanded by a young woman named Nari. She was brilliant, dedicated, and she understood the true purpose of her mission. It was not to spread human dominion across the galaxy, but to demonstrate that humanity could build communities far from home, could create civilizations that would be wonders of art and science and peace. As the Hope and its sister ships prepared for launch, Hei-Wan, now elderly but still active in research, reflected on what they had accomplished. She stood in her laboratory, surrounded by data displays and research notes, and she thought about that day in the Grand Hall of the Galactic Council. The pain of that rejection had transformed into fuel. The anger had become determination. And the determination had led to achievements that would have been impossible if the Council had simply accepted humanity into the Federation. In the 5 years since the rejection, humanity had not only advanced technologically, they had also fundamentally changed their way of thinking. The hunger for validation had been replaced by a hunger for knowledge. The desire to be accepted had been replaced by the desire to be excellent. And perhaps most importantly, the fear that had driven so much of human history had been replaced by hope. There was one rule that Jiwoo had instituted at the very beginning, and it had been maintained rigorously. No communication with the Galactic Council. Earth sent no signals to the greater galaxy. Earth broadcast nothing. Earth was, for all practical purposes, invisible. The quarantine that had been imposed as punishment had been transformed into a shield. Behind it, humanity could work without the weight of expectation or judgment. But the projects undertaken in silence were not hidden. They were just quiet. The synthetic intelligences that humanity had created, truly conscious beings with rights and dignity equal to human rights, worked alongside human researchers, and the collaboration produced breakthroughs that neither could have achieved alone. The life extension treatments were not kept secret, but they were not advertised. They simply became available to all humans who wanted them, and the knowledge accumulated in silence was stored in vast archives, ready to be shared if and when the time came. As the 5 years drew to a close, Dong Ho was conducting his 5th major expedition through discovered wormholes. Each time, he found new worlds, new phenomena, new mysteries to explore. He was no longer seeking approval from the Council, he was seeking truth. And in that seeking, he had found something far more valuable than acceptance. He had found purpose. The Discovery emerged from its 5th wormhole jump, and Dong Ho stood on the bridge, looking out at a view of space that no human had ever seen before. Somewhere behind them, beyond the quarantine, the Galactic Council continued their ancient work, unaware that a young species had taken their rejection and transformed it into the foundations of something extraordinary. The silence of Earth was not the silence of submission. It was the silence of focus. It was the silence of a civilization working so hard that they had no time for words. And in that silence, something unprecedented was being born. The first sign that something was wrong came from the outer edges of the Andromeda region in a place called the Stellar Nexus. It was a region of space where massive stars burned with incredible intensity, and it had always been considered dangerous by the Galactic Council's scientists. But the danger had been thought to be understood, manageable, controlled. Then, a phenomenon occurred that had never been predicted by any of the Council's ancient models and equations. A stellar instability began spreading like a wave through the Andromeda region. It was not an explosion, not a supernova, not any of the catastrophic events that the Council had theoretically accounted for. Instead, it was something far more subtle and far more dangerous. A fundamental destabilization of the quantum properties that held massive stars together. Stars began collapsing, but not cleanly. They were tearing themselves apart, releasing energy in uncontrolled bursts. The wave of instability was moving toward the main galaxy, and if it continued at its current rate, it would reach known space in less than 200 years. For the Galactic Council, 200 years was not a long time. It was barely more than an eye blink in their perception. But 200 years was enough time for the instability to expand significantly, enough time for it to become a threat that might be impossible to stop. The Council convened in emergency session. Verath and his fellow members stood in the Great Hall, watching the data streams that showed the expanding disaster. The ancient beings were troubled, and it was clear in their faces. They had not faced a true crisis in millions of years. Their technology had advanced so far beyond the threats of the universe that they had become almost complacent. They knew how to handle pirates, how to manage rebellious colonies, how to maintain their dominion over lesser species. But this was different. This was a force of nature that did not care about their power or their ancient wisdom. "We must run simulations," said Counselor Verath. "We must determine if our current technologies can address this threat." For weeks, the most powerful computers in the Galactic Federation ran simulations, millions of them. The results were consistent and deeply troubling. The current weapons and tools available to the Council would not be sufficient to stop the instability. At best, they might slow it down, but stopping it entirely seemed impossible. "This is unacceptable," said Elder Kalen, his form flickering with agitation. "We have ruled the galaxy for 4 million years. We have overcome every challenge the universe has presented. We cannot be defeated by mere physics. But we are not being defeated by the physics, said one of the younger council members, a being from the crystalline race. We are being defeated by our own assumptions. We assumed that our knowledge was complete. We assumed that we had explored all possibilities. We assumed that there was nothing left to learn. The words hung in the air, uncomfortable and undeniable. Then, one of the council's archivists made a discovery. In the vast databases that had been maintained for millions of years, there was a single entry, barely noticed, about a species called humanity, a young species from a small planet called Earth. They had been rejected for membership in the Federation because they were deemed unprepared and potentially dangerous. They had been placed under quarantine approximately 5 years ago. "Why are we discussing primitive humans when we face extinction?" Varath demanded. "Because," the archivist replied. In the final message they sent before entering quarantine, they mentioned something, a theoretical solution to a quantum destabilization problem. It was their idea, their hypothesis. We dismissed it at the time. It seemed so naive, so elementary. But now, the archivist retrieved the old data file. It was a proposal from Dr. Haywan, sent just before Earth was quarantined. It was a method, theoretical, untested, but mathematically sound, for stabilizing quantum fields on a massive scale. It was an elegant solution, far simpler than anything the Council's engineers had tried, and it might actually work. "They are under quarantine," Varath said slowly. "We cannot contact them. We built the quarantine to separate them from us." "Then we remove the quarantine," said another council member. "We reach out to them. We ask for their help." "They will demand recognition," Kalen said darkly. "They will demand equality. They will take this moment of our weakness as an opportunity to bargain." "Yes," the crystalline being said simply. "They will, and we will deserve that bargaining position. We rejected them. We humiliated them. We told them they were children who should be grateful for our patience. And now we must turn to them for help." There was a long silence. Finally, Varath made a decision. A message was prepared, sent out through the deep space communication network. It was encrypted, targeted specifically at Earth's communication systems. The message was simple. "We need your help. Will you respond?" The response came within days, but it was not what the Council expected. Instead of an immediate acceptance, they received a query. "What do you need, and what are you offering in return?" The question struck at the heart of everything the Council had assumed about their relationship with humanity. It was not a question of supplicants asking to serve. It was a question of equals negotiating. When the Council explained the crisis, the situation became even clearer. The response from Earth came with a detailed technical analysis that showed not just agreement with Haywan's original proposal, but significant improvements to it. Improvements that could only have come from years of continuous research and development. Improvements that suggested that Earth had spent the last 5 years advancing far beyond what the Council had imagined was possible. "How is this possible?" Varath whispered, looking at the data. "They did not stagnate," the archivist said quietly. "While we assumed they remained static, they advanced. While we were complacent, they were working. And now, they are years ahead of us in this particular field of study." The Council sent another message, this time asking directly, "How far have you advanced? What have you achieved in the time since our rejection?" The response was simple. "Everything you will need to know. First, help us stop this disaster. Then, we can discuss what humanity has become." As the Galactic Council prepared to work with humanity for the first time as something approaching equals, on Earth, the news of the contact had spread like wildfire. Haywan, now very elderly, smiled when she heard that her old proposal had finally been taken seriously. Jiwoo, though long dead, would have approved of the way humanity had handled this moment. They did not gloat. They did not demand immediate submission or apology. They simply offered what the council needed, and they prepared to negotiate from a position of strength. The disaster was coming. But for the first time in millions of years, the Galactic Council would face it not alone, but in partnership with a younger species. A species they had rejected. A species that had spent 5 years in silence, advancing beyond anyone's expectations. A species that was about to teach the galaxy a lesson about the dangers of underestimation. The World Council chamber on Earth had changed in the 5 years since Ji-Woo had made his historic decision to embrace silence. It was now a place of intense activity, filled with displays and monitors showing data from across human civilization. Representatives from every corner of humanity gathered here now, but they had also learned to work with something beyond themselves, synthetic intelligences that had become as integral to human decision-making as humans themselves. When the message from the Galactic Council arrived, it sent a wave of uncertainty through the room. For the first time since the rejection, humanity had to consider their response to the very beings who had dismissed them. The decision was too important to be made quickly or without careful consideration. Young Ka-Rin, who had emerged as one of humanity's leading diplomats and thinkers, stood before the assembled council. She was in her 30s, part of the generation that had grown up knowing nothing but the unified, advancing human civilization that had emerged after the rejection. She had studied the Galactic Council's request carefully, and she had also read the historical accounts of Teo's experience at that terrible first contact. "They are asking for our help," Ka-Rin said, her voice clear but thoughtful. "They are asking because they need us. This is a moment of leverage that we could use for tremendous advantage. We could demand instant membership in a restructured federation. We could demand apologies and reparations. We could demand recognition of everything they did wrong." There was murmuring in the room. Many people agreed with this assessment. "But," Ka-Rin continued, "we must consider what kind of species we wish to be. The Council rejected us because they were arrogant. They were certain of their superiority. They believed that their way was the only way. If we respond to their crisis with demands for revenge or for complete submission, we become like them. We become the arrogant ones. We become the species that sees others' suffering as an opportunity for leverage." An older woman stood up. It was Dr. Hei-Wan, now very ancient, her hair white and her body frail, but her mind still sharp. Many people in the room had never met her in person, but everyone knew her name. She had been there at the Council's first rejection of humanity. She had worked tirelessly during the 5 years of silence to advance human science and medicine. "I was in that grand hall," Hei-Wan said, her voice quiet but commanding immediate silence in the room. "I felt the humiliation of rejection. I wanted to prove them wrong, and I did help with that effort. I worked as hard as anyone to advance human knowledge, but I also learned something important in these years. I learned that proving someone wrong is different from making them into your enemy." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "The Galactic Council underestimated us. That was their mistake. But their mistake does not obligate us to repeat their mistake in reverse. They did not help us when we needed it. But that does not mean we should refuse to help them now that they need us. The question is, who do we want to be? Do we want to be beings who help others because it is strategically advantageous? Or do we want to be beings who help others because it is right?" Another voice spoke up. It belonged to Ho-Jin, a young engineer who had worked on the colony ships. "But if we help them without demanding recognition or change, don't we just go back to being second-class citizens? Don't we accept the position they wanted to put us in?" "No," said Aura, one of the synthetic intelligences, in her calm, logical voice. "The difference is that we will have proven ourselves through action rather than words. We will have demonstrated not through argument, but through achievement that we are their equals, perhaps more than their equals. And they will know this. They will understand what they have rejected. The debate continued for hours. Back and forth, humans and synthetic minds considered every angle, every possibility, every consequence. This was how humanity made major decisions now. Not through the command of a single leader, but through the careful, thorough consideration of a diverse population of minds working toward consensus. Finally, a decision began to emerge. Humanity would help. They would share their technology, their knowledge, their improvements to HFY's original proposal. They would help the Galactic Council stop the disaster spreading through Andromeda. But they would do so with conditions. Not conditions born of greed or a desire for revenge, but conditions born of a simple need for truth and recognition. The message that went out to the Council was composed with great care. It was written by Karin, reviewed by HFY, and approved by the consensus of the World Council. It said simply, "We will help you. We will share everything we have learned. We will work alongside you to solve this crisis. In return, we ask for one thing, that you acknowledge the truth of what has occurred. Acknowledge that you rejected us unjustly. Acknowledge that we have advanced far beyond your expectations. Acknowledge that humanity is not a species to be quarantined, but a species to be recognized as your equal." The response from the Council came quickly. There was a long silence, and then a message from Vareth himself. "We accept. We will make these acknowledgments, and more. We will dismantle the quarantine. We will open the way for humanity to take its place as a full member of a transformed galaxy. But first, we must save it together." The collaboration that followed was unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. Human scientists and engineers worked side by side with the Council's ancient minds. The synthetic intelligences of humanity contributed insights that bridged the gap between human intuition and the Council's computational power. Methods that had never been tried before were developed and tested. HFY, in her last months of life, was there to see the first tests of the solution. She stood with Karin, watching through a data display as the stabilization field was activated. The quantum instability in the Andromeda region began to slow, then to stabilize, then to reverse itself. Slowly, gradually, the disaster was being prevented. "We did it," Karin whispered. HFY smiled. "Humanity did it," she corrected. "We made our choice to help. And in making that choice, we became something more than we were before. We became a species that could be trusted. A species that understood that true strength is not about taking advantage of others' weakness, but about lifting each other up." As the Queen of Andromeda was stabilized and the crisis was averted, the Galactic Council made a historic announcement. They were dissolving the old structure. The Federation would be reformed into something new, a true assembly where all species had genuine voice and genuine power, and humanity would be invited to take a central role in this new structure. But before any of that could happen, there was something else that needed to occur. The galaxy needed to understand what humanity had become in the silence. The galaxy needed to see the achievements that had been made in the 5 years behind the quarantine. And when that reveal came, it would change everything.